They put me on a performance plan, said I wasn't delivering enough impact, that I needed to improve. At the same time, they were still using everything I built. Same system, same architecture, same core logic that powered their entire product. Nothing had changed, except the story they were telling about me. The meeting lasted less than 15 minutes. Ryan led it, calm, structured, confident, like he had already rehearsed every line. "This isn't about punishment," he said. "It's about helping you grow." I didn't respond. Not because I agreed, because something didn't add up. If my performance was the problem, why was my work still running everything? Why were the systems I built still being used in every demo, every investor call, every internal presentation? They didn't question that. They just reframed it. "The team built this. We've been scaling this together. Engineering has done a great job." Always we. Never specific, never traceable. And now, apparently not good enough. The PIP document came through right after the meeting. 30 days, vague objectives, improve cross-team communication, demonstrate higher ownership, increase measurable impact. Nothing tied to actual output. Nothing tied to the system. Just language that sounded right, without meaning anything. That's when I stopped thinking about performance, and started thinking about something else. Why would they put me on a plan, while still depending on the work I was doing? That's not evaluation, that's positioning. Positioning me as replaceable, while continuing to rely on something they didn't fully understand. I didn't push back, didn't argue, didn't try to defend myself, because the moment I stepped out of that meeting, I realized something more important. This wasn't about fixing my performance. It was about controlling the narrative around it. And once that narrative is set, everything else starts to follow. How people see your work, how decisions get made, who gets credit, who gets removed. They thought the PIP was the first step. It wasn't. It was just the part they wanted me to see. What they didn't realize was that I could see everything else. And once you see how the system actually works, you stop reacting to it. You start watching it, quietly, carefully, until it shows you exactly where it breaks. Before the PIP, there was no question about my role. I was the one who built the system, not part of it, not supporting it. Built it from the first version that barely worked. To the architecture they were now presenting as production ready. Back then, it wasn't even a real product. Just an idea Ryan was pitching. A platform that could handle high-volume data in real time. Fast, scalable, reliable. That was the promise. But there was nothing behind it yet. No backend, no infrastructure, no way to actually support what he was saying. That's when I came in, not to improve something, to create it. From zero, I set up the environment, designed how services would communicate, built the core processing layer that handled everything behind the scenes. Requests, data flow, failures, all of it. There was no team at the time, no documentation, no existing structure to follow, which meant every decision mattered. How the system scaled, how it handled load, what happened when something failed, and more importantly, how it recovered without anyone noticing. That part became critical, because Ryan wasn't selling technology, he was selling confidence. And confidence breaks the moment something fails publicly. So I built the system to absorb failure. Retries, fallbacks, redundancies. Layers that kept everything stable, even when something underneath wasn't. At the time, it was just good engineering. Later, it became something else. Because, when you build every layer yourself, you don't just understand how it works. You understand why it works. Where it's strong, where it's fragile, what it depends on. That kind of knowledge doesn't show up in dashboards. It doesn't get summarized in reports. And it doesn't transfer easily, especially when things move fast. Ryan never questioned any of it. He didn't need to. As long as the system performed, as long as demos worked, as long as nothing broke in front of investors, that was enough. And I made sure it always worked, every time, quietly. Without needing attention, without needing explanation. That became the pattern. He presented, I built. He simplified. I stabilized, and over time, that separation created something neither of us really addressed. He understood what the system did. I understood how it held together. And those are not the same thing. Because when everything is working, that difference doesn't matter. Until someone decides to evaluate performance without understanding what they're actually evaluating. At the beginning, it felt straightforward, not equal, but aligned. Ryan handled everything outside the system. Investors, strategy, messaging. He knew how to turn complexity into something simple enough to sell. And for a while, that worked. Because I was focused on the part no one else saw. The system itself, the part that made everything he said real. Before every major presentation, he would come to me. Not for approval, for clarity. How fast can it handle scale? What happens if traffic spikes? Can we say, this is retaliation? They weren't deep technical questions, but they were the right ones, the kind that shape perception. So I explained it, not in simplified terms, in actual behavior. How requests moved, where delays could happen, what I had already solved, what still needed work. Then he'd take that and translate it into something clean, confident, easy to repeat. We've built a scalable system designed for high-volume performance. That was his version. Not wrong, just missing everything that made it true. At the time, I didn't think about that difference. I assumed we were working toward the same outcome, from different sides. That was the trust. Unspoken, functional. He trusted me to make it work. I trusted him to represent it accurately. And every time a demo succeeded, that trust reinforced itself. Because success hides gaps. If nothing breaks, no one asks deeper questions. Over time, that trust turned into dependence. Not just on the system, on me. But it didn't look like that from the outside. From Ryan's perspective, everything was under control. The system performed. The metrics looked right. The narrative held together, which meant the process was working. And if the process is working, there's no reason to question it. That's where the gap started. Small, at first. Just a difference in understanding. But it grew with every new feature, every new layer, every decision that added complexity without visibility. He knew what the system did. I knew what it depended on. That difference didn't matter, until someone needed to explain it. And once explanation becomes necessary, simplification stops working. Because you can present outcomes, but you can't present stability, without understanding what holds it together. And that's the part no one ever asked about, until much later. When the narrative started to shift, and the same system that used to prove value, became something they tried to measure without context. The shift didn't happen overnight. It started with small changes, the kind that are easy to ignore when everything still works. More meetings were added, more people involved, more structure around decisions. We had grown, new hires, new layers, more expectations. That part made sense. What didn't was where I started to disappear. At first, it was subtle. Meetings I used to be part of, now happening without me. Decisions being made, before I even knew they were being discussed. Not because I was too busy, because I wasn't included. Ryan stopped coming to me before presentations. Stopped asking the questions he used to ask. Not because he understood more, because he believed he already had the answers. From his perspective, the system was stable, predictable, ready. That's what he had been presenting. That's what everyone believed. And because nothing was visibly failing, no one challenged it. Instead, the system became something else. Not a process to understand, a result to reference. The platform handles scale. The system is production ready. Engineering has already solved that. Statements, clean, confident, disconnected from how things actually worked. New engineers joined the team. Smart people, capable, but they didn't build the system. They inherited it, which meant they saw the structure, not the decisions behind it. They worked with documentation, with summaries, with what had been simplified enough to pass along, but the deeper logic, the edge cases, the hidden dependencies that kept everything stable under pressure. Those weren't visible, and no one was walking them through it. Because, from the outside, there was nothing to explain. Everything worked. Metrics looked fine. No major incidents. Which meant the system was solid. That's how it looked. But underneath, the gap was getting wider. Not in performance, in understanding. Each new layer added complexity. Each simplification removed context. And over time, the system became something people used, without fully knowing what made it reliable. That's when perception started to shift. Not about the system, about me. I wasn't the one defining how things worked anymore. I was the one maintaining it, keeping it stable, fixing things when needed, quietly, consistently, but not visibly. And once your work becomes invisible, it becomes easy to redefine your value. Not based on what you built, based on what others can see. That's when the narrative changed. Not because anything broke, because everything worked too well to question. And in that kind of environment, the person behind the system becomes easier to replace than the system itself. Once the narrative shifted, the changes became easier to see. Not because they were obvious, because they were consistent. I wasn't being removed from the system. I was being removed from everything around it. Conversations, decisions, visibility. At first, it showed up in small ways. Feature discussions I used to lead. Now happening without me. Architectural decisions being made, based on simplified versions of the system. Not wrong, just incomplete. Engineers started asking different people for direction. Not because I didn't have the answers, because I wasn't positioned as the one to ask. That's how perception works. People don't follow knowledge, they follow signals. And the signal was clear. I wasn't central anymore. I was support. The person who keeps things running. Not the person who defines how they work. That distinction matters, because once you're seen as support, your work becomes expected, not recognized. Invisible, but required. I noticed it in how updates were shared. Ryan would summarize progress in meetings. We've improved system performance. We've optimized back-end efficiency. Always we, always high level. Never tied to the decisions that made those changes possible. And because no one questioned it, that version became reality. New engineers adapted quickly. They worked within the system as it was presented. Interfaces, APIs, predefined flows. Everything structured to look clean, understandable, but missing the context that held it together. They weren't doing anything wrong. They just didn't have the full picture. And no one was giving it to them. Because from the outside, there was no reason to. Nothing was failing, nothing was unstable. Everything looked under control. That's what made the disconnect possible, not failure. Stability. The system worked so well that it removed the need to understand it. And once that happens, the person who built it becomes easier to overlook. Because if something doesn't need explanation, it doesn't need attribution. Over time, that gap stopped being passive. It became structured. Responsibilities were reassigned. Ownership was redefined. Not in a way that broke anything, in a way that redistributed visibility. Away from me, toward the team. Toward Ryan, toward the narrative that was already being built. I didn't push back, not because I didn't see it. Because I wanted to understand it. How far it would go. What they actually believed they had replaced. Because once perception becomes system, it starts to drive decisions. And those decisions eventually reveal what people really understand, and what they don't. The feedback didn't come all at once. It showed up gradually, in reviews, in one-on-one meetings. In comments that sounded reasonable on the surface. You need to communicate more. Your impact isn't always visible. We'd like to see stronger ownership, nothing specific. Nothing tied to actual output, just language that was hard to argue with. Because it wasn't wrong. It just wasn't complete. At first, I took it seriously, tried to adjust, joined more discussions, explained decisions more often, documented parts of the system that had never needed documentation before. Not because they were unclear, because I was being told they were. That's how it works. You start adapting to feedback, before questioning where it's coming from. But the more I adjusted, the less it changed anything. The feedback stayed the same, still vague, still general, still disconnected from the actual work being done. That's when it started to feel off. Not like improvement, like positioning. Because real feedback changes as you respond to it. This didn't. It stayed fixed. As if the outcome had already been decided. And the feedback was just filling in the space around it. Ryan led most of those conversations, calm, measured, consistent. He never raised his voice, never said anything directly negative, which made it harder to push back, because there was nothing concrete to disagree with, just patterns, repeated often enough to feel real. Lack of visibility. Need stronger alignment. More measurable impact. Phrases that sound objective, but don't point to anything specific. That's the part that matters, because once something is hard to measure, it becomes easy to define. And whoever defines it controls the narrative. I started paying attention to how my work was being referenced, not the technical details, the language around it. In meetings, the system was still central, still powering everything, still performing the way it always had. But the way it was described had changed. The team improved stability. We've optimized performance. Engineering aligned on the architecture. Always broad, always shared, never traced back to decisions, or the person making them. At the same time, my role was being described differently. Less about building, more about needing direction, needing alignment, needing improvement. That disconnect didn't happen by accident. It was consistent. Across meetings, across feedback, across how work was presented and how people were evaluated. That's when it became clear. This wasn't about performance, it was about perception. And once perception becomes the metric, performance stops being the deciding factor. The PIP wasn't a reaction to what I was doing. It was a continuation of what had already started. A formal version of a narrative that had been building for a while, quietly, consistently, and intentionally. The formal plan came a few days later. Not unexpected, just confirmed. A calendar invite, HR included this time. Ryan joined a few minutes late. Same tone as before, calm, structured, controlled. They walked through the document like it was routine. 30 days, clear milestones, defined expectations. At least, that's how it looked. But once you actually read it, nothing was clear. Improve cross-functional communication. Demonstrate stronger ownership. Deliver measurable impact across teams. No baseline, no specific examples, no reference to the system. The same system that was still running everything. The same system being used in every demo, every investor update, every internal metric review. None of that showed up in the plan. That's what stood out, not what was written, what was missing. I asked a simple question. What exactly needs improvement in my current work? Ryan didn't answer directly. He reframed it. It's about consistency. It's about how your work is perceived. We need to see more visible impact. Perceived, visible. Not actual output. Not system performance. Just how it looked from the outside. That's when it stopped being about work and became about positioning. Because once performance is defined by perception, the criteria can shift any time. And if the criteria keeps shifting, there's no way to actually meet it. That's the structure of it. Not impossible on paper. Just undefined in practice. I didn't argue, didn't push for specifics, because by then, the pattern was already clear. The outcome wasn't going to change based on anything I said. The plan wasn't there to help me improve. It was there to document a direction that had already been chosen. A formal version of everything that had been happening informally. The shift in narrative. The removal from decisions. The reframing of my role. Now it had structure, timeline, language that could be referenced later. That's what the PIP actually was. Not a starting point, an end point. Something you point to when the decision needs to be justified. I signed it, not because I agreed, because it didn't matter. The document wasn't written for me. It was written for everything that came after. Once it was in place, the rest would follow naturally. That's how it works. You don't remove someone by saying they're not needed. You create a process that makes it look like they didn't meet expectations. Even if those expectations were never clearly defined. I left that meeting the same way I entered. No reaction, no visible change, but internally. Something had shifted. not in how I saw the company, in how I saw the situation. This wasn't something to respond to. It was something to observe. Because once everything is defined by perception, the only thing that matters is what actually holds up when perception fails. And that's not something you argue about. It's something you let play out. After the PIP was in place, nothing actually changed. Not in the system, not in the work. Everything kept running the same way it always had. Requests processed, data flowed. The platform performed without issues. From the outside, nothing supported the idea that performance was a problem. That's what made it clear. This wasn't about fixing anything. It was about defining something. I started paying attention to where the narrative came from, not the technical side. The conversations around it. Who explained what? Who answered questions? Who people turned to when they needed clarity? And the pattern was consistent. Ryan controlled the explanation, not the system itself, just how it was described. He translated everything into something simple, something repeatable, something that didn't require deeper understanding. And because the system kept working, that version was accepted. No one challenged it. No one needed to. That's the advantage of stability. It hides complexity. But it also hides dependency. I went back through the way the system had evolved, not line by line. At a higher level, how decisions had been made, what had been prioritized, where trade-offs were taken, and more importantly, what had never been fully transferred. There were parts of the system that looked simple from the outside, interfaces, endpoints, clean abstractions. But underneath that, there were layers that only made sense if you had been there when they were built. Edge cases that weren't documented. Fallback behaviors that existed because something had failed months earlier. Connections between services that weren't obvious unless you knew why they were there. None of that was visible in documentation. None of it showed up in summaries, because it was never meant to be explained at that level. It just worked. That's what they were relying on, not just the system, the context behind it. And that context wasn't something they had. That's when the situation shifted. Not emotionally, logically. They weren't evaluating my performance. They were evaluating a version of the system they believed they understood, and using that version to define my role. The problem was, that version wasn't complete. They could operate the system, deploy it, use it in demos. But they couldn't explain how it behaved under pressure, or why it stayed stable when things went wrong. That difference matters, because when everything is working, it doesn't show. But the moment something changes, that's what determines whether it holds together. That's what they didn't see. And that's what made the PIP irrelevant. Because you can't evaluate something accurately if you don't understand what you're measuring. At that point, it stopped being about defending my work, or proving anything. There was nothing to prove. The system was already doing that. The only question was, what would happen when the version they believed in no longer matched reality? And that wasn't something I needed to create. It was already there, waiting, under the surface. All it needed was to stop being managed the way it had been. Once I saw the gap, the rest became easier to understand. Not because anything changed, because I stopped looking at the system the way they did. They saw outputs, performance metrics, dashboards that confirmed everything was working. I saw dependencies, not just what the system did, but what it needed to keep doing it. That difference matters, because output is visible. Dependency isn't. And systems don't fail because of what they show. They fail because of what they rely on. I went through the architecture in my head, not line by line, layer by layer. Where services connected, how data moved between them. What happened when something didn't respond the way it should. There were parts of the system that looked stable, because they always had been. But stability doesn't mean independence. It usually means something else is compensating, retries, fallback, logic, load balancing decisions that weren't obvious from the outside. Things designed to absorb problems before they became visible. That's what I had built. Not just functionality, behavior under pressure. And that behavior depended on context, timing, thresholds, assumptions that were never written down, because they didn't need to be at the time. Now they did, but no one was asking, because from their perspective, there was nothing missing. The system ran. Deployments succeeded. Metrics stayed within expected ranges, which meant everything was fine. That's the assumption, and assumptions create blind spots, especially when they're reinforced by success. I started paying attention to how the team interacted with the system, what they monitored, what they ignored, where they expected stability, and where they didn't even think to look. That's where the leverage was, not in control of the system, in understanding how it behaved when something subtle changed. Not a failure, just a shift. Because large systems don't break all at once. They drift, then degrade, then fail. And that process doesn't start where people expect. It starts when no one is watching. That's what I had been managing the entire time. Quietly, without needing to explain it. Adjusting thresholds, tuning behavior, compensating for edge cases before they became problems. None of that showed up in reports, but all of it mattered. Because, without it, the system would still run. Just not the way people thought it would. That's the difference between something that works and something that stays reliable. They had access to the system. They could deploy it, use it, present it, but they didn't have the context that made it stable. And that context was the only thing that actually mattered under pressure. That's the leverage, not something I needed to take, something that already existed. The only question was, what would happen if I stopped compensating for it? Once I understood the leverage, the decision wasn't what to do. It was what not to do. I didn't need to prove anything. Didn't need to argue the pip. Didn't need to defend my work, because none of that would change the narrative. The narrative had already been set. Anything I said would just be interpreted through it. So I stopped trying, not working, trying to correct perception. That's the difference. Instead, I shifted how I approached everything, from builder to observer. I still did my job, delivered what was assigned, responded when asked. Nothing changed on the surface, but underneath, I stopped doing something I had been doing the entire time, compensating for gaps no one else saw, for assumptions that didn't hold under pressure, for edge cases that weren't documented. Before, when something felt slightly off, I adjusted it, preemptively, quietly, without needing to explain it. Because it was faster that way, and it kept everything stable. Now, I didn't. If something wasn't explicitly defined, I didn't redefine it. If something wasn't monitored, I didn't add visibility. If a behavior depended on context only, I understood. I didn't optimize it. Not because I couldn't, because it wasn't part of what they were measuring. That's the key. The PIP didn't evaluate system stability. It evaluated perception, communication, visibility, impact as it appeared in meetings. So I aligned with that exactly. I communicated what was necessary, documented what was expected, delivered what was assigned, and nothing beyond that. No extra layers, no silent fixes, no adjustments to keep things running smoother than they were designed to. That wasn't part of the role they defined for me, so I stopped including it. The system didn't change immediately. It still ran, still performed, still looked stable from the outside. Because systems like that don't react instantly. They rely on patterns, on consistency, on behavior that has been maintained over time. Remove that behavior, and nothing happens right away. At first, that's what makes it hard to notice, because the absence isn't visible, not immediately. It shows up gradually, in places that seem unrelated, small inconsistencies, slight delays, things that don't break anything but don't feel quite right either. And when those signals appear, they don't point to a single cause. They spread across layers, across services, across assumptions no one realized were there. I didn't trigger anything, didn't change the system. I just stopped holding it together the way I used to. And once that layer is gone, what's left isn't broken. It's just real. The way it actually behaves. Without correction, without compensation, without someone quietly adjusting it behind the scenes. That's when the difference starts to show. Not between me and the team, between perception and reality. And that gap doesn't stay hidden for long. I didn't build a plan, not in the way people expect. There was no list, no sequence of actions, no moment where I decided to do something, because there was nothing to execute. The system already had everything it needed. All I did was stop interfering with it. That's the part most people don't understand. They think control comes from action, from changing something, from forcing an outcome. But in systems like this, control often comes from absence, from what you choose not to adjust, not to fix, not to compensate for. I had been doing that for months, quietly smoothing out inconsistencies, adjusting thresholds before they became visible, making sure edge cases never reached the surface. Not because I was told to, because I understood what would happen if I didn't. Now I let those edges exist. If a service responded slower than expected, I didn't tune it. If a fallback triggered more often than it should, I didn't optimize it. If something depended on a behavior that wasn't clearly defined, I didn't redefine it. Everything stayed within the system's design. Nothing was broken. Nothing was altered. It just wasn't being maintained the same way. From the outside, everything still looked normal. Deployments went through. Metrics stayed within acceptable ranges. No major alerts. No obvious failures. That's what made it effective, because no one reacts to something that looks stable. They only react to problems they can see. And this wasn't visible yet, not in a way that triggered concern. It showed up in smaller ways, latency slightly higher in certain flows, retries occurring more often in specific cases, timing inconsistencies that didn't break anything, but didn't feel consistent either. Each one easy to explain on its own. Each one too small to escalate. That's how systems drift, not through a single failure, through accumulation of small, unaddressed changes. That's what I was allowing, not creating, allowing. The team continued working the same way, following the structure they had, relying on the system as it had always behaved, because from their perspective, nothing had changed. And technically, they were right. The system was the same. The architecture was the same. The code was the same. What changed was the layer that kept everything aligned. The layer that understood how those pieces interacted under pressure and adjusted them before anyone noticed. That layer wasn't documented, wasn't assigned, wasn't visible, which meant when it stopped being there, no one noticed immediately. They just experienced the system as it actually was, without correction, without compensation, without someone quietly making it behave better than it should. That's the difference between a system that works and a system that is managed. They still had the first one, they just didn't have the second, and without it, everything that looked stable starts to feel unpredictable. Not broken, just harder to explain. And once something becomes hard to explain, it becomes harder to control. At first, nothing stood out. The system continued to run. Requests processed. Dashboards looked normal. If you only checked the surface, everything was still within range. That's how drift begins. Not with failure, with confirmation. Everything working just enough to reinforce the assumption that it will keep working. Then small inconsistencies started to appear. Not errors, not outages, just slight variations. Response times fluctuating more than usual. Retries triggering in places that normally stayed quiet. Latency increasing in patterns that didn't follow a clear cause. Each one minor, each one explainable on its own. The kind of signals teams notice, but don't prioritize, because nothing is technically broken. That's what makes them easy to ignore. And when something is easy to ignore, it tends to repeat. Those variations didn't stay isolated. They started showing up across different parts of the system. Not all at once, gradually. A service here, a dependency there. Each one reacting to the same underlying behavior, without anyone connecting them together. From the outside, it looked like normal fluctuation. Traffic changes, background processes, temporary load. That's how it was interpreted, because that's what people expect. They look for visible causes. Changes in input, changes in usage, something external they can point to. What they don't look for is the absence of something that used to be there, because absence doesn't show up in logs. It doesn't trigger alerts. It doesn't announce itself. It just changes how things behave over time. By mid-cycle, the patterns became more consistent. Certain flows took longer. Fallbacks activated more often. Throughput stayed acceptable, but efficiency started to drop. Still not critical, still not enough to escalate, but noticeable. The kind of thing that gets mentioned in passing. We should look into this, probably just temporary. Let's monitor it. That's the stage where drift becomes visible, but not urgent, which means it continues. Because attention stays focused on what looks stable, and the system still looked stable. No major failures, no critical alerts, no incidents that required immediate action, just a growing collection of small issues that didn't connect to a single cause. That's what makes it difficult, not complexity. Fragmentation. Each team sees their part. Each part makes sense in isolation. No one sees how they relate. And without that connection, there's nothing to fix. Only things to observe. I didn't step in, didn't adjust anything. Because from the perspective they had defined, everything was still within expectations. The system was running. Metrics were acceptable. The PIP criteria were being met, at least on paper. But underneath that, the behavior was changing. Not enough to break, just enough to reveal. What happens when a system is no longer being managed the way it was designed to be? And once that shift starts, it doesn't reverse on its own. It continues. Until the difference between what people think is happening and what's actually happening becomes impossible to ignore. It didn't become a problem all at once. It crossed a threshold. Gradually, quietly. Until the patterns were no longer ignorable. The same inconsistencies that had been dismissed earlier started showing up more frequently, in more places at the same time. Latency wasn't just fluctuating, it was trending. Retries weren't occasional, they were expected. Fallback paths weren't rare, they were active. Still no failures, still no outages. But the system didn't feel stable anymore. But nothing pointed to a clear cause, because each issue made sense in isolation. A small delay here, a retry pattern there, a fallback triggering more than expected. Individually, none of it justified escalation. Together, it didn't make sense. That's the part that matters. Not that something is wrong. That it can't be explained. Because systems are built on assumptions. And when behavior stops matching those assumptions, people start looking for what changed. Deploy logs were reviewed. No major changes. Configurations checked. Nothing unusual. Traffic patterns analyzed. Within expected ranges, everything pointed to the same conclusion. Nothing had changed, which made the situation harder to understand. Because, if nothing changed, why did behavior change? That question started to move upward, from teams to management. Ryan was still presenting updates, still framing everything as manageable. Some instability under load, nothing critical. We're monitoring closely. That worked at first, because technically, he wasn't wrong. But the gap was growing. Between what was being said and what people were seeing. That's when leadership started asking different questions. Not about metrics, about understanding. Do we know why this is happening? Is this expected behavior? Who owns this part of the system? Ownership. That question matters. Because ownership implies understanding. And understanding requires context. The room didn't go silent, but the answers weren't immediate. Each team could explain their part. What they were seeing, what they had checked, what they assumed. But no one could connect it. No one could explain how those pieces interacted. Or why they were all shifting at the same time. That's when the system stopped being a set of components and became something else. A single behavior. No longer predictable, no longer clearly understood. And once that happens, the focus shifts from managing outputs to questioning assumptions. The narrative was still there, but it was starting to lose alignment with reality. And when that gap becomes visible, it doesn't stay contained. It moves upward. Until someone asks the question that matters. Not what's happening, but why no one can explain it. 14. The question didn't come from the team. It came from above. Not about performance, not about timelines, about understanding. Who actually understands how this system behaves under load? Simple question, direct, and for the first time. There wasn't an immediate answer. Ryan tried to respond, framed it the way he always did. High level, confident. The engineering team has it covered. But that wasn't enough anymore, because by then, the gap was visible. Not just in metrics, in explanation. Leadership wasn't asking for updates. They were asking for clarity. And clarity requires something different. Not summaries. Context. How do these services interact when fallback triggers? Why are retries increasing across multiple layers? What changed in the system behavior? Not what people were used to answering. Because those questions don't have simple responses. They require understanding how the system actually works, not just what it does. Each team answered what they could. Explained their part. Their metrics, their assumptions, but none of it connected. Because no one owned the behavior as a whole, only fragments. That's when the pattern became clear. Not just that something was off, that no one could explain why. Ryan's responses started to shift. Less confident, more reactive. Trying to piece together answers from different teams, reframing, buying time. But the questions didn't stop. They became more specific. More focused, more difficult to generalize. Because the system wasn't behaving in a way that matched the narrative anymore. And once that happens, the narrative loses authority. Not because it's challenged, because it can't explain reality. That's when attention shifts. From what is being said, to what is actually happening. Someone finally asked the question that had been missing. Who was responsible for the original architecture? Not ownership, responsibility. Who built it? Who understood why it was built that way? There was a pause, not long, but noticeable, because the answer was obvious, just not acknowledged until that moment. My name came up, not as part of the team, not as support, as the reference point. The person who could explain how things connected. Ryan didn't interrupt, didn't reframe it, because there was nothing to reframe. The system was no longer aligning with the simplified version he had been presenting. And without alignment, the narrative couldn't hold. That's what exposure looks like. Not a reveal, not a confrontation. Just a shift in where people look for answers. From the story to the source. And once that shift happens, everything that was built on the story starts to lose weight. Quietly, without needing to be challenged directly, because reality does that on its own. After that meeting, nothing changed immediately. There was no announcement, no correction, no acknowledgement of what had just happened. Just a shift, subtle but clear. The questions stopped being filtered. They came directly now, from leadership. From teams trying to understand behavior that no longer made sense through summaries. And when those questions came, they didn't go to Ryan first. They came to me. Not formally. Not with a title change. Just naturally. Because at that point, the system wasn't something that could be explained at a high level anymore. It needed context. And context wasn't part of the narrative they had been using. The PIP didn't disappear overnight. It stayed, technically still active. Still documented, but it stopped being referenced because the criteria it was based on no longer aligned with what people were seeing. You can measure perception for a while, until reality stops matching it. Then perception loses value, quietly, without needing to be challenged. Ryan didn't bring it up again. Not in meetings, not in one-on-ones. The conversations shifted. Less about evaluation, more about understanding. What's causing this behavior? Why does this dependency react this way? What happens if this pattern continues? Different questions. The kind that require actual answers. Not summaries, not positioning. Just explanation. I answered when asked. Explained what was necessary. Nothing more. No extra layers. No silent corrections. No effort to reshape how things were being perceived. That part was over. Not because anything was resolved, because it didn't need to be. The system had already shown what mattered. Not through failure, through behavior. The difference between what people thought they understood and what they actually did. That gap had been there the entire time. Now it was visible. And once something becomes visible, it doesn't need to be argued, it just exists. The pip eventually closed. No formal discussion, no conclusion, just removed, like it had never really been about performance to begin with. Nothing else changed. Same role, same team, same system. From the outside, everything looked the same, but it wasn't. Because I wasn't operating the same way anymore. I wasn't filling the gaps, wasn't adjusting for things that weren't defined, wasn't carrying the system beyond what was expected. I did the work, exactly as it was scoped. Nothing beyond that. The system still ran, still performed, just without the layer that made it feel effortless. And that difference was enough. I didn't need to leave. Didn't need to prove anything. Didn't need to fix the narrative. Because, in the end, it corrected itself. I stayed, just not the way they expected. And that was the only shift that actually mattered.